The headlines have already moved on to the next scandal. Maduro is in New York in handcuffs. The airstrikes have ended. The press conferences are over. But the real story is just beginning now, and no one is telling it to you. What happened in Venezuela is not a story of a courtroom or international justice as they want you to believe. It is a story of economic systems, of control over global resources, and of a tectonic shift in world power that is happening right under your nose while you watch helicopters and soldiers on television. This analysis that you are about to see now completely steps away from the carefully orchestrated spectacle and looks at what really happened, not through political personalities or partisan narratives, but through pure and hard economic structure. It tracks how an operation packaged and sold as international law enforcement actually fits within a much larger strategy involving critical natural resources, global trade routes, and the control of economic systems that literally shape who has power on the planet. For years, pressure was applied silently away from the cameras. Economic sanctions were progressively tightened. Financial channels were systematically narrowed. Energy markets changed dramatically. China's economic footprint expanded throughout South America like a growing shadow. Venezuela did not suddenly become important out of nowhere last week. It became inevitable and unavoidable after decades of strategic moves. What seems abrupt and sudden in the news is actually the final move in a long sequence of chess, where negotiation gradually gave way to military force, and brutal market logic completely replaced traditional diplomacy. This report examines deeply why this happened now specifically, not 5 years ago or 10 years in the future. Why oil denomination in alternative currencies, parallel monetary systems, and China's massive role in the Western Hemisphere are at the absolute center of this military decision, even as official government explanations continue to change and contradict themselves, and why the glaring contradictions between public statements from different authorities reveal much more about the true motives than the carefully written statements themselves. At this exact moment, on every news network you turn on, you are watching the same story repeated in an infinite loop. Special forces dramatically descending from the sky like an action movie. A Latin American president in handcuffs being escorted. Political commentators praising impressive tactical precision and American strategic brilliance. They desperately want you to stay focused on the visual spectacle, on the bold and brave invasion, on the indisputable military success. Because if you are watching the helicopters and the soldiers, you are not looking at the balance sheet and financial flows. If you are fascinated by the military operation, you are not asking about oil contracts and monetary agreements. This was not regime change for democracy as they are selling in the headlines. This was not an operation about human rights violations or dangerous drug cartels. This was a debt collection operation executed with attack helicopters and special forces. There is an old rule in geopolitics that everyone pretends doesn't exist, but that silently governs everything. You can't indefinitely sanction the countries that control your vital resources. Not forever, not without devastating consequences that eventually come back to destroy you. For 23 full years, the United States tried to defy this fundamental rule of reality. They sanctioned Venezuela repeatedly. They froze Venezuelan assets around the world. They recognized parallel governments that controlled nothing. They funded opposition movements with millions of dollars. They did absolutely everything, except the one thing they just did this week, until all of that collapsed in the most revealing and transparent way possible for anyone who is truly paying attention. On December 28th, Nicolas Maduro signed massive energy agreements with China worth $18 billion in long-term contracts. Just 2 days after that announcement, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor of the United States, discreetly requested an urgent meeting with Venezuelan authorities in Panama. Not to threaten as they always did, not to impose ultimatum conditions, to humbly negotiate access to the oil that Washington spent 2 entire decades trying to destroy and isolate. What you are witnessing between the lines is not clever strategic diplomacy. It is desperate economic capitulation that was abruptly interrupted by military helicopters because the negotiation was failing. Now, before we dive deep into this analysis that will completely change how you understand what is happening in the world, I need to ask you something. If you want to understand real geopolitics, beyond the superficial headlines, leave a like right now. Subscribe to the channel because every week I bring deep analyses on global economy, power shifts, and what really moves the decisions that affect your life. And tell me in the comments, did you believe the official narrative about democracy and human rights? Or did you already suspect there was something much bigger going on? Let's discover together what really happened. The traditional media has been selling you a story for years that is fundamentally misleading and dangerous. They told you repeatedly that the shale revolution made America energy independent. They told you with confidence that the United States is now the world's largest oil producer and therefore no longer needs to worry about the Middle East or Latin America. This is a carefully constructed half-truth. And in real geopolitics, a strategic half-truth is a complete and destructive lie. The United States does indeed produce massive amounts of oil. That is technically true in the raw numbers, but they produce light sweet, crude, the wrong type for their actual needs. It is like expensive, bubbly, light champagne, extremely expensive to extract from the ground, and fundamentally, it is not what American refineries were built to process decades ago. The critical problem no one explains to you is this. The massive refineries in Texas and Louisiana, the complete industrial backbone of American energy, were built 50 years ago with different technology and specifications. They were designed and optimized specifically to process heavy sour crude, that thick, sludge-like oil that comes from Venezuela and the Middle East, not the light champagne coming out of American shale. America produces expensive energy champagne, but its giant industrial engines run on cheap, heavy diesel. For entire decades, they mathematically solve this problem simply by importing heavy oil in huge quantities from Saudi Arabia, relying on that historical relationship. But that strategic relationship is effectively dead and buried. Now, Saudi Arabia is no longer the West's obedient gas station as it was for 50 years. Riyadh is deliberately cutting production to keep prices artificially high, maximizing its profits. They are officially joining BRICS, expanding alliances away from Washington. They are completely ignoring urgent phone calls coming from the White House. Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman has made it very clear publicly and through actions that he is no longer interested in being an obedient vassal state of the United States following orders. So the United States faced a brutal and inescapable mathematical problem. They were running out of the specific type of oil needed to keep their giant refineries running at full, profitable capacity. And even worse, they had already played their strategic emergency card irresponsibly. During the last 2 years, the administration systematically drained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, SPR, which was supposed to be sacred. The SPR was created and is intended for total war. It is intended for genuine national emergencies of survival. It is absolutely not intended to buy votes by artificially manipulating gasoline prices before convenient political elections. Nevertheless, they opened the taps irresponsibly. They flooded the global market with millions of barrels to keep prices low temporarily before voting. Now the bill has come due and it is brutal. The SPR is at its lowest level since 1983, a completely different era. 351 million barrels, that is all that remains of a reserve that was supposed to protect the nation. Under the Biden administration specifically, 180 million barrels were released in 2022 alone to control prices politically after the conflict in Ukraine began and spiked energy globally. Those critical barrels were not replaced. The reserve is empty. The International Energy Agency projects a terrifying deficit of 1.2 million daily barrels for 2025 if tensions with Iran escalate militarily and Russian sanctions remain tightly in place. So Washington looked desperately at the global map, searching for options. They looked for affordable and reliable heavy oil suppliers. Canada is already pumping at absolute maximum capacity with no room to grow. Russia is heavily sanctioned and completely hostile politically. Saudi Arabia is non-cooperative and strategically pivoting toward Beijing and the yuan. This left only one realistic option remaining in the hemisphere: the massive and practically untapped heavy oil fields of the Orinoco Belt. Venezuela, the answer to the American problem. This is what this military operation is really about at its core. It is not about the total volume of oil in barrels. It is about the denomination of oil in which currency. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the entire Earth, approximately 300 billion geologically verified barrels. But production collapsed dramatically under Maduro in recent decades. Production fell from over 3 million barrels per day at its peak to less than 1 million barrels today. The infrastructure rotted without maintenance. Investments stopped completely. Skilled workers fled the country in droves to survive. So if Venezuela is currently not producing much oil in the numbers, why does it matter strategically so much that it justifies an invasion? Because it is not about current production in 2025. It is about future control over the coming decades. For 50 full years, global oil has been priced exclusively in U.S. dollars, creating a system. This system, called the Petrodollar, creates automatic and artificial demand for American currency globally. Every country that needs oil to function needs dollars to buy it first. There is no choice. This manufactured and constant demand allows the United States to borrow money incredibly cheaply, print trillions of dollars without immediate consequences of devastating inflation, and finance its astronomical debt at much lower interest rates than real economic fundamentals would otherwise allow. But that magic system is visibly fracturing and breaking. Saudi Arabia officially refused to renew its exclusive agreement to sell oil only in dollars. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are increasingly settling energy deals in local currencies or Chinese yuan, completely bypassing the dollar. And Venezuela, according to multiple intelligence reports that the mainstream media conveniently ignores, was preparing to fully integrate its giant energy sector into China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, and price its oil in a basket of currencies led by the yuan and possibly backed by physical gold. If this had happened publicly, China could buy Venezuelan oil without needing to hold U.S. dollars. If China does not need to hold dollars, the demand for American currency plummets globally. If demand falls, the value of the dollar plummets proportionally. If the dollar falls, the cost of servicing the $36 trillion American debt explodes astronomically. This is the real existential threat. Not that Venezuela would sell 1 million barrels a day to China, but that Venezuela sitting on 300 billion barrels would prove to the whole world that you can price oil outside the dollar system and survive. This is what Washington absolutely could not allow to happen under any circumstances. The U.S. dollar is not backed by gold as many people still naively believe. It has not been backed since 1971 when Nixon unilaterally ended the convertibility of the dollar into gold in what became known as the Nixon shock. It is not backed by robust industrial productivity because the American manufacturing base was systematically hollowed out and outsourced to China through decades of free trade policies. The dollar is fundamentally backed by a single thing: an agreement made 50 years ago with Saudi Arabia that completely changed the global monetary system. Oil must be sold exclusively in U.S. dollars with no exceptions. This is the magic trick that sustains everything. Because every nation on earth needs oil to function economically, every nation automatically needs dollars to buy it before anything else. This creates permanent and artificial demand for American currency that has no relation to the real economy of the United States. It allows the United States to print literally trillions of new dollars, export the resulting inflation to the rest of the world that is left holding the devalued dollars, and never face the devastating consequences that any other country would face doing so. This system is called by economists the exorbitant privilege, a phrase coined by a French minister in the 60s. It is the source of extraordinary American prosperity for a full half-century without working proportionately for it. But recently, the magic has begun to fade, and the trick is being revealed to the world. In June 2024, the Saudi-American Petrodollar agreement formally expired after being in effect for 50 years. Saudi Arabia deliberately chose not to renew it, letting it die silently. They now officially accept Chinese yuan for oil sales to China. which is their largest individual customer, surpassing the United States. In November 2024, the United Arab Emirates processed $128 billion in bilateral trade with China completely in yuan, without touching U.S. dollars once. Russia sells oil to India in rupees and rubles through elaborate mechanisms that completely bypass the Western banking system. Iran sells oil to China in yuan through ghost ships and secret refineries. The dollar's share in global foreign exchange reserves dropped drastically from 71% in 1999, when it seemed invincible, to just 58% in 2024, a drop of 13 percentage points. Every percentage point of decline represents approximately $350 billion in reduced demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, the debt that finances the government. This is not abstract. It is hundreds of billions of real demand evaporating permanently. This gradual but inexorable collapse is the existential crisis motivating every American foreign policy decision in recent years. Here's what most superficial news coverage is completely missing by ignorance or design. Venezuela did not happen in geographical or temporal isolation. It is a strategic move in a massive continental economic contest that has been building silently for 2 full decades. China-Latin America trade reached $518 billion in 2024. That is not a typo or exaggeration. More than $500 billion in a single year, and it is growing at approximately 30% annually, with no signs of slowing down. 20 years ago, China represented less than a meager 2% of total Latin American exports. It was insignificant. Today, China is the largest trading partner for the entire South America, surpassing the historically dominant United States. Brazil, the largest South American economy, trades more with China than with the United States now. Peru does too. Chile does too. Ecuador just signed a comprehensive free trade agreement with Beijing in 2024, countering American pressures. Nicaragua did exactly the same, ignoring threats from Washington. 22 out of 33 Latin American and Caribbean nations have officially joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. These are not just abstract trade statistics on spreadsheets. This is real, concrete, permanent, physical infrastructure on the ground. China now owns or directly operates major strategic ports in Peru, Brazil, Panama, and Ecuador, controlling trade choke points. The port of Chancay in Peru, which has just been inaugurated with great ceremony, was specifically designed and built to handle exports from 6 different South American countries directly to Asia, cutting the United States completely out of the supply chain as an intermediary. When you hear analysts talking about Venezuela, you absolutely need to understand this larger context, which is terrifying for Washington. The United States is watching its historical sphere of influence since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 shift economically toward Beijing in an irreversible way. And this shift is not abstract or theoretical. It consists of physical ports, real railways, long-term energy contracts, and payment systems functioning outside of American control. Venezuela currently produces only 780,000 barrels daily, well below its potential. But under Chinese technical management and Russian financial support, without sanctions, that production could easily reach 1.4 million daily barrels within just 18 months of focused investment. But here's the critical problem that triggered this entire violent military operation: that future oil has already been contractually committed for years. China signed oil prepayment contracts with Venezuela worth $62 billion between 2007 and 2024, decades of guaranteed supply. Russia provided another $17 billion in credit lines, all secured by future shipments of Venezuelan crude oil. The United States tried 4 distinct and elaborate strategies to break this growing economic siege. Each of them failed spectacularly. The first strategy was maximum pressure through devastating economic sanctions trying to strangle Venezuela. It failed completely because Venezuela developed export networks that operate entirely outside the American-controlled SWIFT banking system. Ships with flags of convenience that change identity, payments processed in yuan through Chinese banks, refineries in Malaysia that process Venezuelan oil with no questions asked. Washington painfully discovered that sanctioning papers and freezing accounts does not stop physical oil molecules from moving across the ocean. The second strategy was regime change through paid proxies, trying to overthrow Maduro internally. They spent hundreds of millions supporting Juan Guaido, officially recognizing him as the legitimate president of Venezuela, even though he never controlled a single military barracks or government building. By 2023, even the Venezuelan opposition itself had abandoned Guaido as an international joke. American recognition became an embarrassing global diplomatic joke. The third strategy was international diplomatic isolation, making Venezuela a pariah. It failed because 134 United Nations countries never recognized Guaido in any way. Latin America, including giants like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, restored full diplomatic relations with Caracas between 2022 and 2024, completely ignoring Washington's furious objections. The fourth strategy was conditional licenses, allowing companies like Chevron to operate limitedly in Venezuela, but with strings attached. This is failing now because Maduro learned the fundamental lesson: never trust American concessions designed as control levers that can be arbitrarily withdrawn. And then came the final trigger that forced Washington's hand irreversibly. Intelligence reports that the mainstream media is conveniently ignoring completely suggested that Caracas was preparing for what internal financial analysts were calling the economic nuclear option. Venezuela was on the verge of officially integrating its entire energy sector into China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, which already processes hundreds of billions daily. They were actively preparing to price their entire reserves, the largest on planet Earth, not in U.S. dollars, as has always been done, but in a diversified basket of currencies led by the Chinese yuan and potentially backed by physical gold stored in Chinese or Russian vaults. If this had happened publicly with international coverage, it would have been a devastating signal to the entire global South watching carefully. It would have proven empirically to dozens of countries that you can possess massive resource wealth completely outside the American banking system and not just survive, but thrive without consequences. Washington correctly saw this as an existential threat to dollar privilege. It was not about Venezuela specifically as a country. It was about the dangerous precedent it would set. If Venezuela, sitting on 300 billion barrels, could exit the dollar system with impunity, why couldn't Saudi Arabia? Why wouldn't Iraq try? Why wouldn't Nigeria consider it? Why would any commodity producer accept depreciating dollars when they could accept currency baskets or gold? So Washington faced a binary and brutal choice with no intermediate options: accept the emerging new multipolar reality and negotiate as an equal partner among several, or use the only asset they still have in relative abundance: overwhelming military force and power projection. They chose the weapon without hesitation. The operation itself was, from a purely tactical and military perspective, absolutely extraordinary and impressive. Highly trained Delta Force operators surgically extracted Maduro from his fortified presidential residence in Caracas. No reported American casualties. A clean operation. Maduro is now on an American warship sailing toward New York to face a sealed indictment that had been waiting patiently since 2020, when it was drafted. Trump, in the triumphant press conference, could not contain his excitement. He said verbatim, "You'll probably never get to see what I saw last night. It was incredible, sensational. These guys were moving so fast it was hard to keep up." He was watching in real time from Mar-a-Lago, as if it were an episode of his old reality TV show, which in his mind it basically was. But this is where the visual spectacle ends abruptly and the real, lasting consequences begin to emerge. Trump and Marco Rubio were asked repeatedly by persistent journalists at the official press conference, who is going to manage Venezuela now? How long will American forces remain there occupying territory? What is the concrete plan for governing the country? And they had absolutely no coherent answer prepared. Trump explicitly said that American oil companies will move in and help Venezuela rebuild its collapsed energy sector. He was very direct and clear about this without diplomacy. He said it is pathetic how little they have been producing given their massive reserves, and that American companies will fix that quickly. He said the oil would go to other allied countries and to the United States as reimbursement for damages caused by decades of mismanagement. Rubio diplomatically tried to backpedal the next day in interviews, saying that the U.S. doesn't technically need Venezuelan oil. He said this is about good governance and democracy, not about natural resources or material gains. But the glaring contradiction between the two statements tells you absolutely everything about the real motivations. Trump openly says what the operation is really about because he cannot help himself. Rubio manages the international diplomatic fallout and softens the message for public consumption. Venezuela is not the Panama of 1989, as some analysts are erroneously comparing. This is not 1989, when George H.W. Bush sent forces to remove General Noriega in a relatively simple operation. Panama had only 3 million people, a tiny country. Venezuela has 30 million inhabitants, 10 times larger. Panama had a massive and permanent American military base at the strategically vital Panama Canal. Venezuela has neither an American base nor a similar, already controlled strategic asset. Even more importantly, from a structural point of view, Maduro was not a personalist dictator where everything revolves around one person. This was not like removing Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Gaddafi in Libya, where the entire state structure revolved around a charismatic and authoritarian individual. Maduro rose within an established system, the complex Chavista system, an intricate network of powerful military generals, intelligence chiefs infiltrated into everything, completely co-opted judicial officials and paramilitary groups called colectivos that control everything from lucrative ports to basic food distribution. The defense minister is still in place commanding the armed forces. The interior minister, Diosdado Cabello, one of the most powerful and feared figures of the entire regime, is still there consolidating power. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez is still there maintaining continuity. All these people control valuable pieces of the Venezuelan economy as personal fiefdoms. Venezuela has multiple times more generals compared to the average soldier than any other place on earth, an absurd ratio. About 20 times more generals than you would expect in a normal and functional military structure. Every general controls a lucrative monopoly somewhere in the economy. They control gold and diamond mining concessions. They control ports and import taxes. They control oil distribution and smuggling. The military does not just theoretically defend Venezuela. The military literally is the Venezuelan economy in operation. This is where the operation, as tactically brilliant and impressive as it indisputably was, becomes strategically catastrophic of historic proportions, because the entire rest of the world is watching carefully and taking notes. Every country in the global south, from Nigeria to Brazil to Indonesia, is looking at Venezuela now and thinking exactly the same terrifying thing. If we refuse to sell our natural resources in U.S. dollars, will they come after us militarily as well? Are we next? This existential fear does not create loyalty or cooperation, as Washington imagines. It creates an accelerated exodus from the dollar system. At the BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, in October 2024, just a few months ago, Vladimir Putin proudly announced the development of BRICS Pay, a blockchain-based cross-border payment system that completely bypasses the U.S. dollar in all transactions. Brazil is already actively piloting it for bilateral agricultural trade. South Africa processed its first diamond transaction in November using the system. Iran and Russia are settling arms sales completely through it without touching dollars. Venezuela has just formally applied for full membership in the expanded BRICS. If accepted, and it will be accepted without doubt for political reasons, its 303.8 billion barrels of oil reserves will be integrated into an economic architecture completely isolated from Washington and immune to sanctions. The transition has already happened structurally. The world simply hasn't realized it yet, or is pretending not to see. Development. Topic 5. 3 paragraphs with 7 to 8 lines each. There are 3 possible paths forward from this moment, and none of them are clean or simple. Path 1 is the controlled and negotiated transition, where the U.S. brokers a deal with remnants of the existing government and the fragmented opposition. A transitional authority is established with questionable legitimacy. Oil contracts are renegotiated favorably for Western companies. Revenue flows are restructured to pay off old debts. This is the best-case scenario that Washington is selling to the markets, but it requires genuine cooperation from multiple factions that hate each other, years of expensive institutional building in a destroyed country, and political stability in a historically volatile region. Path 2 is complete fragmentation, where the government shatters into pieces. Regional power centers emerge competing violently. Some areas are controlled by military units loyal to the old Chavista regime. Other areas are controlled by armed opposition groups. Still others by criminal networks that fill the power vacuum by profiting from smuggling. Oil production remains disrupted for years or decades. Foreign investment doesn't happen because it is too risky. The humanitarian crisis worsens dramatically with hunger and violence. This is the Iraq-Libya scenario that no one wants to admit publicly, but is historically the most likely based on recent precedents. Path 3 is sustained economic counter-pressure, where China simply does not accept the imposed result. Beijing continues buying Venezuelan oil through ghost ships and secret refineries in Malaysia. They provide massive financial support for resistance elements opposing the government installed by the Americans. China uses its tremendous leverage in other Latin American countries like Brazil and Argentina to diplomatically isolate U.S.-backed structures. They turn Venezuela into a long-term economic battlefield, bleeding American resources. This is the great power competition scenario that could last an entire generation. None of these three paths resolve quickly or favorably, and the Trump administration has not clearly articulated which path they are pursuing or how they plan to navigate the brutal complexity. Financial markets are optimistically pricing in the scenario where Venezuelan oil comes back online quickly, priced in dollars, flowing to American refineries and allied nations, increasing global supply. But history suggests extreme caution and skepticism. Iraq was supposed to be quick and became a 20-year swamp. Libya was supposed to stabilize and fragmented permanently. Afghanistan was supposed to transition smoothly and collapsed in weeks. Removing governments militarily is relatively easy with technological superiority. Building functional states that don't hate you is extraordinarily difficult and expensive beyond any initial estimate. And the question that absolutely no one in Washington seems to be asking honestly is, what happens if this doesn't work as planned? What happens if Venezuela fragments violently into civil war? If oil production remains disrupted for an entire decade? If China doubles down on alternative supply chains, completely bypassing Latin America? If other Latin American nations like Brazil and Mexico decide that the risk of working closely with the United States is now too high and pivot toward neutrality or alignment with Beijing? These are the critical questions that will determine if this operation was a long-term strategic success or a costly mistake that accelerates American decline. And at this moment, so early in the process, we simply do not know the answer yet. What we can say with absolute certainty is this: the economic contest for South America is no longer diplomatic background noise. It is front and center in global geopolitics, and the stakes are physical oil, dollar dominance, and global positioning for the coming decades. The helicopters have already left Caracas. Maduro is on a warship sailing to New York. The news cycle will move to the next manufactured crisis within days. But the structural damage to international trust is permanent and irreversible. The trust that held the international system together for 80 years since the end of World War II is irreparably broken now. The fundamental idea that there were respected international rules, that national sovereignty mattered and was inviolable, that military force was a last resort, used only in extreme cases and not a convenient first option, all of that has completely disappeared. And you cannot rebuild international trust with well-written press releases or eloquent diplomatic speeches. Countries will eternally remember what happened here in Venezuela as a dangerous precedent. They will vividly remember that when a nation rich in oil tried to trade outside the dollar system honestly, American special forces came in the middle of the night with helicopters and invaded it militarily, and they will act according to this terrifying knowledge by developing defenses. The petrodollar era is ending irreversibly, not because of monetary inflation or cryptocurrencies or any of the things financial commentators superficially discuss on programs. It is ending because the United States has just demonstrated to the entire world that the system is no longer based on mutual benefit and voluntary cooperation as it was sold. It is fundamentally based on military coercion and threats of violence. And in the long historical run, coercion is infinitely more expensive economically and unsustainable than genuine cooperation based on shared interests. The world is reorganizing structurally before our eyes, even if the media does not cover it adequately. New financial systems are being built brick by brick outside of American reach. New economic and military alliances are forming at an accelerated pace. New currencies and payment mechanisms are emerging and being tested. And the country that could have led this inevitable transition, that could have shaped the change in a way that preserved its relative influence and economic prosperity for future generations, chose instead to fight against it with absolutely everything it has available, including raw military force. This is the real historical tragedy here that will be studied for decades. Not that change is coming, because geopolitical change was always coming inevitably as other countries developed. The real tragedy is that it will be much harder, more violent, more expensive, and more chaotic for everyone than it needed to be if it had been managed diplomatically. The military helicopters descending on Caracas were just the dramatic opening scene of this movie. The real story is what comes after in the coming years. And based on every historical precedent we have available for analysis from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, what comes after is going to be considerably more complicated, bloody, and expensive than the people in charge are prepared to handle honestly. This was not an operation about democracy or human rights or drug cartels, as the superficial headlines want you to blindly believe. This was a desperate operation about controlling the future of global energy denomination. It was about preventing 300 billion barrels of oil from proving that you can exit the dollar system and survive prosperously. It was about sending a terrifying message to every resource-producing country: cooperate on our terms or face our special forces. But that message, instead of creating obedient submission, is creating the exact opposite. It is accelerating the global race away from the dollar faster than any speech by Putin or Xi could have achieved alone. Countries that were hesitant about alternative systems are now running desperately to build and implement them. Nations that were comfortable holding reserves in dollars are now frantically diversifying into gold, yuan, euros, anything but American assets that can be frozen. Central banks that processed everything through New York are now developing bilateral routes that completely bypass the United States. The Venezuela operation did not secure the future of the petrodollar, as was the strategic intent. It accelerated its funeral and placed a visible expiration date on the system. And all the world's major players are seeing this happen and reacting rationally. If you have made it this far in this deep analysis, you now understand something that 99% of people watching the news do not understand at all. You see beyond the carefully choreographed military spectacle. You see the real economic structures, the resource flows, the monetary changes, and the existential competition between systems that is defining the entire 21st century. This information is real power. Use this knowledge to understand where the world is really going, not where politicians say it is going in staged press conferences. If this analysis opened your eyes to geopolitical realities that the mainstream media deliberately hides or does not understand, leave that like right now. Share this video with everyone you know who wants to understand the real world beyond superficial and propagandistic headlines. Comment below. Are you surprised by this analysis? Did you suspect there was something bigger going on? Do you think the dollar will survive this decade, or are we witnessing the beginning of the end? I want to know your honest opinion. and let's debate constructively in the comments. Subscribe to the channel right now because every week I bring deep analyses like this on global economy, power shifts, and the real forces shaping the future you will live in for decades to come. Venezuela is just the beginning of this story, not the end as the news will make it seem when they change the subject tomorrow. The next chapters involving Chinese responses, Latin American realignments, the accelerated collapse of the petrodollar, and potentially much larger conflicts are just beginning to unfold before us. Stay tuned. Stay informed beyond the official narratives. And primarily, understand that you are living through one of the greatest global power shifts in human history. Future generations will study this moment as the turning point where the American unipolar system began its terminal collapse and the multipolar world emerged from the ashes. You have the luck or the misfortune of being alive to witness this happening in real time. Thank you for watching until the end. Thank you for caring enough to seek the truth beyond manufactured headlines. And thank you for being part of a community that values real analysis over comfortable propaganda. We'll see you in the next video where we will continue tracking how this story unfolds and what it means for your economic future and the future of your children. Until the next analysis, keep your eyes open and your critical mind questioning everything they tell you.